The Morgan family gathered in the somber elegance of Westfield and Sons' funeral home, their customary vigor subdued by the dark suits and dresses required for the occasion. My grandfather, Harold Morgan, patriarch and self-made millionaire, had passed away at 92 after a brief illness, leaving behind an empire of real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and the sprawling Victorian mansion that had been the center of family gatherings for 4 decades. The funeral service had been predictably dignified. Harold wouldn't have wanted excessive emotion or flowery eulogies. The minister spoke of hard work, integrity, and family legacy. Heads nodded in solemn agreement, though I noticed more than a few furtive glances exchanged between my cousins, aunts, and uncles. Everyone knew what came next. After the burial, the family reconvened at grandfather's house, where Walter Blackstone, the family attorney for over 30 years, waited to read the will. I watched my relatives arrange themselves in the grand living room, positioning for both comfort and strategic advantage. Uncle Robert, my father's older brother, claimed grandfather's leather wingback chair as if testing it for fit. His wife, Diane, perched beside him on an antique settee, her French manicured nails drumming impatiently on her designer handbag. My cousins, Blake and Melissa, lounged with practiced casualness that didn't quite mask their anticipation. Aunt Victoria, my father's younger sister, sat rigidly on a high-backed chair, her expression carefully composed. Her third husband, Gregory, stood behind her, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder. I took a seat in the corner, partly hidden by a large Boston fern, the same spot where I'd often sat during family gatherings, watching rather than participating in the complex dynamics of the Morgan clan. At 29, I was the youngest adult family member and, according to frequent reminders, the disappointment. While the rest had followed grandfather into business, finance, or law, I'd chosen to teach history at a small community college, a career path that had prompted more than one lecture from Harold about wasted potential. Walter Blackstone cleared his throat, silencing the murmured conversations. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and removed a thick document from his leather portfolio. "Before I begin," he said, his voice carrying the gravitas of his profession, "I want to extend my personal condolences. Harold was not only my client, but my friend for over 3 decades. Uncle Robert nodded impatiently. Yes, we're all grieving, Walter. But perhaps we could proceed with the business at hand." I caught the slight narrowing of Walter's eyes, the only indication that he'd registered the disrespect, before he opened the document and began to read. What happened in the next 30 minutes would change the Morgan family forever. "I, Harold Edward Morgan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament," Walter began, his measured cadence giving weight to each word. The standard legal preamble continued for several minutes, outlining revocations of previous wills and appointing of executors. I noticed my relatives' increasing restlessness as Walter methodically worked through the preliminary sections. Finally, he reached the meat of the document. "Regarding the distribution of my estate," Walter read, pausing to turn the page, "I have given this matter considerable thought over the years. My legacy represents not merely financial assets, but the values and principles by which I have lived my life." Uncle Robert shifted in grandfather's chair, leaning forward slightly. Aunt Victoria's perfectly manicured hand reached up to clasp her husband's, while my cousins exchanged glances. "To my son, Robert Morgan, I leave my collection of antique watches and the sum of $5 million. A satisfied smile spread across Uncle Robert's face, though it faltered slightly when Walter continued. "To my daughter, Victoria Hammond, I leave my late wife's jewelry collection and the sum of $5 million. Aunt Victoria nodded, apparently pleased though not surprised by her inheritance. "To my grandchildren, Blake and Melissa Morgan, I leave the sum of $2 million each." My cousins visibly relaxed, Blake going so far as to bump his sister's shoulder with a small grin. I noticed none of them looked in my direction, the expectation being, apparently, that I would receive some token bequest at best. "The remainder of my estate," Walter continued, "including the Morgan building downtown, all other real estate holdings, my investment portfolios, and this family home, along with all its contents not otherwise specified, I leave to—" He paused, whether for dramatic effect or to turn the page wasn't clear. But in that moment of silence, I could feel the family's collective anticipation. The bulk of grandfather's estate, conservatively valued at over $100 million, was the prize everyone had positioned themselves for over the years. My son, James Morgan. The silence that followed was absolute. My father had passed away 3 years earlier, a heart attack at 64 that had devastated me, but had been treated by the rest of the family as primarily an inconvenience and restructuring opportunity. Since his death, I'd been increasingly isolated from family gatherings, invited only to major holidays, and now the funeral. "That's impossible," Uncle Robert finally sputtered. "James is dead." "I'm well aware," Walter replied evenly. "If you'll allow me to finish, I leave the remainder to my son, James Morgan, or, in the event of his death, to his only child, Alex Morgan." Every head swiveled toward me, expressions ranging from shock to outrage to calculation. I kept my face carefully neutral, though my heart hammered in my chest. This was entirely unexpected. My father and grandfather had been cordial, but never particularly close, and I'd assumed my own relationship with Harold had been similarly distant. "This is absurd," Uncle Robert declared, standing up. "Alex is completely unprepared to manage this level of assets. Harold would never have intended this." "On the contrary," Walter countered, "Harold was quite explicit about his wishes. He revised this will approximately 6 months ago after considerable deliberation." "6 months ago, he was already failing," Aunt Victoria interjected. "His judgment was compromised. We all saw it." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Harold underwent a complete cognitive assessment at the same time this will was prepared. The results, which I have on file, indicate he was fully competent to make these decisions." Blake leaned forward, his business school training evident in his rapid pivot. "Alex, we should talk about forming a family management council. This is a lot for one person to handle, and pooling our expertise would benefit everyone." His sister Melissa nodded enthusiastically. "We could set up a family office, keep everything consolidated but professionally managed. I could see their strategy forming in real time. They'd lost the ownership battle, but were already positioning to control management and, by extension, access to the wealth." Before I could respond, Uncle Robert cut in. "This will is going to be contested." Harold wasn't thinking clearly. He would never have left his life's work to someone with no business experience, no financial training, no interest in exploiting his legacy for personal gain. I finished quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading began. The room fell silent again, tension crackling in the air. Walter Blackstone cleared his throat. "There is a letter as well," he said, producing a sealed envelope from his portfolio. "Harold instructed that it be read after the will." Uncle Robert snatched it from Walter's hand. "I'll read it." Uncle Robert tore open the envelope with little regard for its contents, extracting a single sheet of grandfather's distinctive cream stationery. I recognized the Morgan Company letterhead at the top. Harold had insisted on writing all important correspondence by hand, considering it both more personal and more binding than electronic communication. "To my family," Robert began reading, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If Walter is reading this letter, then I have passed on, and you have just learned of my decision regarding the distribution of my estate." He paused, looking up with narrowed eyes. "This is dated just 6 months ago. He was already showing signs of confusion by then." "Continue reading, please," Walter instructed firmly. Robert's jaw tightened, but he returned to the letter. "I expect this decision has come as a surprise to most of you, perhaps even to Alex. Allow me to explain my reasoning, which I have considered carefully over the past several years." The room was utterly silent now, every person frozen in attention. "I built Morgan Enterprises from nothing, working 60-hour weeks while raising a family and investing in our community. My hope was always that this legacy would continue through future generations who understood not just the privilege of wealth, but the responsibility that comes with it." Robert's voice had begun to falter slightly, his confidence visibly shaken by the words he was reading. "I have watched each of you over the years, noting how you approach both business and personal matters. Robert, you have a keen mind for opportunity, but little patience for the human element of business. Victoria, you have social grace, but have never shown interest in the actual work behind our family's success." Aunt Victoria's face flushed with indignation, while Uncle Robert's knuckles whitened around the paper. "Blake and Melissa, you both have talents, but I've observed an entitlement in you that concerns me. You expect rewards without demonstrating the work ethic or moral compass necessary to steward significant wealth responsibly." My cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances, their earlier confidence evaporating with each word. James was perhaps most like me, hardworking, principled, though occasionally too rigid in his thinking. His early death was a loss I felt deeply, more than many of you might have realized. I swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. My father and grandfather had maintained such formal relations that I'd never considered there might have been deep respect, even love, beneath the surface. Robert's voice had dropped almost to a whisper now, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear him. And then there is Alex, quiet, observant Alex, who chose education over wealth accumulation, service over status, who visits elderly neighbors without being asked, and volunteers teaching history to underprivileged children after already putting in full days at the community college. I felt heat rise to my face as all eyes turned to me again, this time with varying degrees of shock and reassessment. Alex may not have sought my financial legacy, but has demonstrated the character and values that I hoped my wealth would foster. Sometimes we find our true heirs in unexpected places. Robert stopped reading, his face a mask of disbelief. This can't be right. How would he even know what Alex does outside of work? They barely spoke at family gatherings. Harold kept better track of his family than you might imagine, Walter commented mildly. Please continue. Robert glared at the attorney, but returned to the letter. I know this decision will not be popular with some of you. You may feel entitled to more, or believe yourselves better equipped to manage my estate. You may even consider legal action. His voice took on a hint of satisfaction at this last line, clearly already contemplating exactly such a response. Before you proceed down that path, however, I should mention that I have left additional documentation with Walter that will be revealed only if my wishes are contested. This documentation contains my observations about certain business practices, personal behaviors, and ethical choices made by various family members over the years. I believe it would be in everyone's best interest if these remained private. The color drained from Robert's face. Around the room, I noted similar reactions from Victoria, Blake, and even Melissa, whose typical poise had completely abandoned her. The choice, of course, is yours. I hope you will respect my decision and perhaps take this opportunity for reflection. Life offers many chances to realign our priorities. This could be one of them. Signed, Harold Morgan. As Robert finished reading, the letter dropped from his fingers to the carpet. No one moved to pick it up. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones, heavier, filled with unspoken revelations and the distinct sense that carefully constructed facades were crumbling throughout the room. Walter Blackstone calmly retrieved the letter. Is there anything else you'd like me to clarify about Harold's wishes? Uncle Robert recovered first. Years of corporate negotiation, evident in his rapid reassessment of the situation. Harold was clearly more observant than we realized, he said carefully. Still, this is an enormous responsibility to place on someone with no experience in asset management. Alex, surely you see the wisdom in bringing in family expertise to help you navigate these waters. I could read the strategy behind his words. Uncle Robert hadn't abandoned his goal of controlling grandfather's fortune. He'd simply adjusted his approach. Instead of a legal challenge, he would position himself as the essential guide, the experienced hand without whom I would surely fail. I appreciate your concern, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. But I believe grandfather had faith in my judgment, including my judgment about when to seek assistance and from whom. Victoria leaned forward, her voice taking on the conciliatory tone she typically reserved for major donors at charity galas. Alex, darling, none of us doubt your intelligence or character. That's precisely what Harold recognized in you. But there are complexities to managing an estate of this magnitude that even the brightest person wouldn't grasp without proper experience. What Victoria means, her husband Gregory interjected, is that we're offering help, not trying to take control. A family unified approach. I noted how quickly they had pivoted from shock and outrage to strategic alliance building. It was almost impressive. I'm open to discussions about collaboration, I said carefully. But I'll need time to process grandfather's wishes and understand exactly what responsibilities I'm assuming. Blake, ever the pragmatist, nodded vigorously. Absolutely reasonable. We should all take some time to absorb this news. Maybe reconvene in a week or so to discuss potential structures for family involvement. I caught the glance he exchanged with his sister. They weren't giving up either, just regrouping. Actually, I said, reaching into my messenger bag, there's something else that should be addressed today. All eyes turned to me as I withdrew an envelope similar to the one Walter had produced earlier. The difference was that this one bore my name in grandfather's distinctive handwriting, with instructions that it be opened only after his death. Grandfather gave me this about a year ago, I explained, breaking the seal. He asked me not to mention it to anyone or open it until after he was gone. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, tension returning as I unfolded a single page covered in Harold's precise script. Dear Alex, I read aloud, if you're reading this, then Walter has executed my will, and you have learned of your inheritance. You're probably as surprised as the rest of the family, though for different reasons. I paused. glancing up to see the undisguised concern on my relatives' faces. What I didn't include in my formal letter is that you and I have had many more conversations than the others realize. Our Tuesday lunches over the past 3 years have been the highlight of my later life, and your insights into history, ethics, and the responsible use of influence have shaped my thinking more than you know. Uncle Robert's face contorted in disbelief. Tuesday lunches? What Tuesday lunches? I didn't answer him, continuing instead with grandfather's letter. I suspect that immediately following the reading of my will, various family members will begin positioning themselves to guide, influence, or possibly control how you manage your inheritance. They will cite your inexperience, your academic background, or your youth as reasons why you need their help. Around the room, I saw flickers of discomfort as grandfather posthumously called out exactly what had just transpired. What they don't know is that for the past 2 years, you've been quietly working with Walter and my most trusted advisors, learning the fundamentals of the Morgan holdings. Your graduate degree in economic history has provided a surprisingly solid foundation, and your natural thoughtfulness has served you well in understanding the various enterprises. Melissa's mouth actually fell open. You've been training with Walter? For 2 years? Walter Blackstone's expression remained professionally neutral, though I detected the slightest hint of satisfaction in his eyes. The documentation I mentioned, I continued reading, that would be revealed if my will is contested, includes records of certain financial irregularities I discovered in the divisions managed by Robert, questionable tax strategies employed by Victoria and Gregory, and evidence of Blake and Melissa using company resources for personal expenses. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its ticking for a moment. I don't share this to be vindictive, but to ensure you're armed with the truth as you navigate the family dynamics to come. You have more leverage than they will initially realize. Use it wisely and, I hope, mercifully. I looked up from the letter to find my relatives in various states of shock and calculation. Uncle Robert's face had gone from red to gray, while Aunt Victoria appeared to be having trouble maintaining her composure. There's more, I said, returning to the letter, but it concerns private advice from grandfather that isn't relevant to share. I carefully refolded the page and returned it to its envelope. In the ensuing silence, I turned to Walter. I believe I'm now ready to sign whatever paperwork is necessary to begin the transition of grandfather's estate. Of course, Walter replied, removing several documents from his portfolio. We can handle the preliminary signatures today, though the full transfer process will take some time. As he arranged the papers on the coffee table, the rest of the family remained frozen in their seats, clearly reassessing not only their immediate strategies, but years of family dynamics. I had gone from overlooked academic to power player in the span of 30 minutes, and none of them quite knew how to process this transformation. Uncle Robert was the first to attempt recovery. These irregularities Harold mentioned, he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. There are reasonable explanations for any discrepancies he might have noted. Business is complex, and Harold was old school in his accounting practices. I'm sure there are explanations, I agreed mildly, signing where Walter indicated. And I'm not particularly interested in digging into past issues unless forced to do so. The implied condition hung in the air, their cooperation in exchange for my discretion. Aunt Victoria stood abruptly. I think we all need time to process today's events. This has been unexpected. Her husband Gregory nodded vigorously, already guiding her toward the door. Absolutely right. Alex, we'll be in touch once everyone's had a chance to regroup. Blake and Melissa followed suit, murmuring awkward condolences and congratulations in the same breath before making their hasty exit. Only Uncle Robert remained, watching as I continued signing the necessary documentation. Those Tuesday lunches, he said finally. How did none of us know about them? I looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Grandfather said you were all too busy to visit him regularly. He had a standing lunch reservation at Marcello's every Tuesday. I started joining him after Dad died, initially just to check on him, but it became a regular thing. Robert's expression shifted between disbelief and something that might have been regret. For 3 years? Every Tuesday? Almost every Tuesday, I corrected, unless one of us was traveling or ill. And the training with Walter and Harold's advisors? Grandfather suggested it about 2 years ago. Said I had a good mind for systems and ethics, but needed practical experience with the specific holdings. I've been working with them evenings and some weekends. Robert shook his head slowly. He never said a word, not a hint. He was a private person, I replied, signing the final document and handing the pen back to Walter. And I think he enjoyed having something that was just ours. He talked about Dad a lot during those lunches, stories I'd never heard before from when they were younger. Something flickered across Robert's face, perhaps recognition of the relationship he might have had with his father if different choices had been made. Did he ever talk about me? The question came out almost involuntarily, with a vulnerability I'd never before witnessed in my uncle. I considered how to answer, weighing honesty against kindness. "He was proud of your business acumen," I said finally. "He mentioned more than once that you could spot a profitable opportunity faster than anyone he'd ever met." Robert nodded, accepting this limited affirmation. "And my other qualities?" "He wished you valued people as much as profits," I said quietly. "He thought you might have been happier if you had." The simple truth landed heavily between us. For a moment, I glimpsed the person beneath the polished executive exterior, someone who had spent a lifetime seeking approval through achievement, only to discover too late that he'd been optimizing for the wrong metrics. Walter cleared his throat discreetly. "That should be all for today. I'll be in touch tomorrow to begin reviewing the portfolio in detail." Robert stood, straightening his suit jacket in a gesture that seemed more habitual than necessary. "I should go. Diane's waiting in the car." He paused at the doorway, turning back with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Harold made the right choice," he said finally. "I wouldn't have seen that a day ago, but he did. Good luck, Alex." After he left, Walter and I sat in the sudden quiet of the grand living room, a space that was now, improbably mine. "Your grandfather would be proud," Walter said, gathering his papers. "Not just of how you're handling the inheritance, but of how you handled the family just now. Firm, but not vindictive." "I'm still processing it all," I admitted. "When he gave me that letter last year, I assumed it was some small bequest or personal memento. I never imagined this." Walter smiled slightly. "Harold was observing all of you for years. He saw what others missed because they were too focused on their own agendas to notice his, including his regular lunches with his supposedly estranged grandson," I asked with a small smile of my own. "Especially those," Walter confirmed. Though I believe he genuinely treasured those meetings beyond their strategic value. He spoke of them often. As Walter prepared to leave, I remained seated, looking around at the family photographs on the walls, the leather-bound books in the built-in shelves, the small personal items that reflected Harold Morgan's long and accomplished life. "Any advice?" I asked as Walter reached the door. "Now that I'm suddenly the head of the Morgan family?" The elderly attorney considered this for a moment. "Remember that wealth is a tool, not an identity. And perhaps consider the value of Tuesday lunches with those who might otherwise be overlooked. Your grandfather discovered it late in life, but it brought him great joy." 1 month after the funeral, I sat in what had been my grandfather's home office, now mine, reviewing quarterly reports from the various Morgan holdings. The learning curve had been steep, but not insurmountable, especially with the foundation Harold had ensured I received during those 2 years of discreet training. Walter had been invaluable, as had Harold's longtime financial director, Patricia Chen, and his operations manager, David Mercer. Together, they formed a transition team that was gradually guiding me into my new role while maintaining the stability of the various enterprises. I'd made few changes to the office itself. Harold's desk, a magnificent piece of mahogany that had witnessed 4 decades of business decisions, remained the centerpiece of the room. I'd added only a few personal touches: books on economic history that had informed my teaching, a photograph of my father and me fishing when I was about 10, and a small framed note Harold had written me after attending one of my guest lectures at the university 3 years earlier. "Thoughtful analysis and engaging delivery. You found your calling, Alex. H.M." At the time, I'd taken it as grudging acceptance of my academic career. Now I understood it had been genuine approval of the path I'd chosen, different though it was from his own. A gentle knock interrupted my review of the latest property acquisition proposal. "Come in," I called, expecting Patricia with the updated projections she'd promised. Instead, Melissa stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. My cousin, usually the picture of polished confidence in designer business attire, wore jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair, typically arranged in a perfect blowout, was pulled back in a casual ponytail. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. "Is everything okay?" She sat, glancing around the office with a hint of nostalgia. "It's strange seeing someone else in this room. I used to come in here sometimes when I was little, pretending to be important like Grandpa." I smiled at the image of a young Melissa play-acting at business. "I'm still getting used to it myself. Some mornings I expect him to walk in and ask what I'm doing in his chair. A small silence fell between us, not entirely uncomfortable, but laden with the weight of our family's recent upheaval. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the funeral," Melissa finally said. "About Grandpa, about what he wrote in those letters, about a lot of things." I waited, sensing she needed to proceed at her own pace. "He was right about me," she continued, her voice quieter now. "About the entitlement. I've been living off the Morgan name and connections without really contributing anything valuable." The admission clearly cost her something, her usual polish giving way to genuine vulnerability. "That seems like an important realization," I offered, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with her self-assessment. "Blake and I have been talking," she continued. "He's doubling down, convinced that Grandpa made a mistake and that eventually you'll realize you need his expertise. He's already strategizing how to position himself as indispensable to you." This didn't surprise me. Blake had always been the most nakedly ambitious of the cousins, his Harvard MBA and stint at McKinsey featuring prominently in his carefully curated professional narrative. "And you?" I asked. "What's your strategy?" Melissa met my gaze directly. "I don't have one. That's why I'm here. I want to apologize for how I've treated you over the years. The dismissive comments about your career, the way I practically ignored you at family gatherings. And I want to ask if there might be a place for me in Grandpa's, in your companies where I could actually learn and contribute, not just coast on the family name." The request took me by surprise. Of all the potential scenarios I'd anticipated with my cousins, Melissa's genuine soul-searching hadn't been among them. "What brought this on?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Besides Grandpa's posthumous character assessment?" She smiled ruefully. "I've been shadowing Mom on the charity circuit for years, expecting to eventually take her place hosting galas and sitting on boards. After the funeral, I realized I don't want that life. It feels empty." She leaned forward slightly, earnestness replacing her usual calculated charm. "I have a business degree I've never really used, and organizational skills that could be valuable if applied to something meaningful. I'm not asking for a handout or a shortcut. I'm willing to start wherever makes sense and prove myself." I studied my cousin, seeing her perhaps clearly for the first time, not as the polished, somewhat shallow socialite I'd assumed her to be, but as someone capable of honest self-reflection and potential growth. "We could use help with the Morgan Foundation," I said after a moment. "The charitable arm needs restructuring to align better with the values Grandfather outlined in his letters. It would mean real work, starting at a level that might feel beneath your qualifications, at least on paper." "I'd like that," Melissa replied without hesitation. I think Grandpa would like it too." 6 months after assuming control of the Morgan Enterprises, I hosted the first official family business meeting in the conference room of the downtown Morgan building. The space, with its sweeping views of the city skyline and imposing mahogany table, had been the site of countless high-stakes negotiations and strategic decisions over the decades of my grandfather's leadership. Today, it would witness something Harold Morgan might never have imagined: a gathering of family members who had begun the slow, sometimes awkward process of redefining their relationships with each other and with the family legacy. Melissa arrived first, characteristically punctual and prepared with color-coded folders containing her proposals for the Morgan Foundation's new focus areas. Over the past months, she had thrown herself into the work with unexpected dedication, her natural organizational talents flourishing when applied to meaningful projects rather than social calendars. "The Community Education Initiative is ready for presentation," she reported, setting up her materials at one end of the table. "I've included budget projections and potential community partners for the pilot program." I nodded, impressed as always by her thoroughness. Looking forward to it. The board was intrigued by the concept outline. Blake arrived next, his expression guarded but not hostile. After several failed attempts to position himself as my essential advisor, he had finally accepted a more modest role overseeing one of the smaller development projects, a mixed-use property in a transitioning neighborhood. To his credit, once he'd moved past his initial resentment, he'd applied himself to the task with genuine effort. "Monthly progress report," he said, handing me a slim folder. "We're on schedule and slightly under budget. The local business incubator spaces are already at 60% pre-leased." "That's excellent progress," I acknowledged, noting the hint of pride that crossed his face at the genuine praise. Uncle Robert and Aunt Victoria arrived together, an unusual sight given their typically separate spheres of operation. Robert had reluctantly stepped into a consulting role, his expertise still valuable even as his direct control had been eliminated. Victoria, surprisingly, had found a niche in community relations. her social skills proving useful in building partnerships with local organizations. Traffic was terrible, Victoria commented, taking a seat beside Melissa. The mayor's office called this morning, by the way. They're interested in the public-private partnership we discussed for the riverfront development. As Walter Blackstone joined us, followed by Patricia Chen and David Mercer, I surveyed the assembled group with a sense of cautious optimism. The transition had not been smooth or simple. There had been resistance, resentment, and more than a few heated conversations. Uncle Robert still occasionally attempted to circumvent my authority, and Blake had moments of transparent calculation about how to advance his position. But there had also been unexpected developments. Melissa's genuine transformation from socialite to committed foundation director. Victoria's discovery that her networking skills could serve purposes beyond social climbing. Even Robert's grudging acknowledgement that some of my academic approaches to business brought fresh perspective to long-standing challenges. Before we begin the formal agenda, I said once everyone was settled, I wanted to share something with you all. I opened the leather portfolio Harold had used for decades, another item I'd kept from his office, and removed a photograph I'd discovered while going through his personal files the previous week. I found this in grandfather's records, I explained, passing it around the table. It was taken about 30 years ago when the Morgan building was first completed. The photograph showed a much younger Harold standing proudly in front of the newly constructed headquarters, surrounded by his family, Robert and my father James as young executives, Victoria just out of college, their spouses, and even Blake and Melissa as small children, everyone beaming with pride at what Harold had built. What struck me, I continued as the photo made its way around the table, was grandfather's note on the back. Robert, who was holding the photograph, turned it over. In Harold's distinctive handwriting was a single line, the true Morgan legacy, not the building, but the family who will carry its purpose forward. A thoughtful silence fell over the room as the significance of the message registered. For all his business acumen and wealth accumulation, Harold had ultimately valued something deeper. I believe grandfather's final decisions, the will, the letters, the restructuring of leadership, were his attempt to restore what he saw as the true purpose of his life's work, I said. Not just financial success, but the creation of something meaningful that could unite rather than divide his family. Victoria dabbed discreetly at her eyes. He had a strange way of showing it. He was a complicated man, I acknowledged, and he made his share of mistakes in how he handled family relationships. But I think, in the end, he tried to correct course. Robert studied the photograph, his expression unreadable. He built all this from nothing. Whatever his methods, that deserves respect. It does, I agreed. And so does his final wish, that we find a way to work together, each contributing our strengths rather than fighting over control. I opened my portfolio again, removing the agenda for our meeting. With that in mind, shall we begin? As we turned to the business at hand, I caught Walter's approving nod from the end of the table. In his eyes, I saw what I hoped my grandfather might have felt had he been present, cautious satisfaction at seeing his legacy not just preserved, but perhaps improved upon in ways he hadn't imagined possible. 1 year to the day after Harold Morgan's funeral, I stood alone in the family cemetery, a bouquet of simple white lilies in hand. The morning was crisp and clear, autumn leaves creating a kaleidoscope of color around the carefully tended grounds where generations of Morgans rested beneath granite monuments. Grandfather's marker was characteristically understated compared to some of the more ostentatious family memorials, a dignified stone bearing only his name, dates, and the phrase, "Builder of Legacy," beneath. I placed the flowers at its base, then stood in silence, reflecting on the extraordinary year that had followed his passing. I thought I might find you here. I turned to see Melissa approaching along the gravel path, her own small bouquet in hand. She placed it beside mine, then stood back, pulling her coat closer against the autumn chill. I wasn't sure anyone else would remember the date, I admitted. Blake wanted to come too, but he's in Chicago for the developers conference, she replied. Even Mom mentioned it at breakfast this morning. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, the rustling of leaves the only sound in the peaceful enclosure. Do you think he knew how it would all unfold? Melissa asked finally. When he wrote those letters and changed his will, did he anticipate how we would respond? I considered the question carefully. I think he hoped. He was always strategic, looking several moves ahead in any situation. But I don't think he could have predicted everything, especially not how you would step up with the foundation. Melissa smiled slightly. I surprised myself with that one, honestly. Her expression grew more serious. The thing is, I'm happier now than I was before. Working on something meaningful, being valued for actual contributions rather than just being a Morgan, it's changed how I see myself. I've noticed, I said simply. Another comfortable silence fell between us, so different from the strained interactions that had characterized our relationship for most of our lives. There's something I've been wanting to ask, Melissa said eventually. Something I've wondered since the funeral. What's that? You could have used that letter from grandfather to completely sideline all of us. You had the leverage to cut the family out entirely, run everything yourself with hired executives. Why didn't you? It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past year, especially during the more challenging moments of the family's transition. Partly because I think grandfather's ultimate goal wasn't to punish anyone, but to create an opportunity for change, I replied thoughtfully, and partly because of something he said during one of our Tuesday lunches, about 3 months before he died. Melissa waited, her expression openly curious. We were discussing a biography of Andrew Carnegie I'd been reading, specifically his approach to philanthropy. Grandfather said something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. He said, "The true test of wealth isn't how much you accumulate or control, but how effectively you deploy it to create value beyond yourself." I looked back at the simple headstone. I think, in the end, he saw the family itself as his most important legacy, not just the businesses or properties or investment portfolios, and he believed that legacy would be stronger if we each found our authentic contribution, rather than simply following prescribed roles. That's surprisingly insightful for a man who spent most of his life focused on empire building, Melissa observed. People can evolve, even late in life, I replied. I think watching Dad die relatively young affected him more deeply than any of us realized. It made him reassess what really mattered. A light rain began to fall, signaling it was time to leave. As we walked together toward the cemetery gates, Melissa linked her arm through mine in a gesture that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The foundation board approved the full expansion of the education initiative, she said as we reached our cars. We'll be able to support double the number of community college scholarships next year. I smiled at the genuine excitement in her voice. Grandfather would approve. He always believed in creating opportunity, even if his definition of that changed over time. Family dinner on Sunday? She asked as she unlocked her car. Blake's back Saturday night, and even Uncle Robert promised to be there. Wouldn't miss it, I assured her. As I drove away from the cemetery, I reflected on the strange, unexpected journey of the past year. Harold Morgan's final decisions, the will, the letters, the careful preparations he'd made without anyone realizing, had set in motion a transformation none of us could have anticipated. The family wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, old habits that occasionally resurfaced, trust that continued to require rebuilding. But we were, undeniably, finding a new way forward together. Perhaps the most valuable inheritance my grandfather could have left any of us. 18 months after assuming leadership of the Morgan Enterprises, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the city's historic Palmer Hotel, addressing the assembled guests at the inaugural Morgan Foundation Community Impact Gala. The event, orchestrated largely by Melissa with input from Victoria, represented the public launch of our restructured philanthropic approach. My grandfather, Harold Morgan, built his business empire on the principle that sustainable success requires investing in both physical infrastructure and human potential. I told the audience of community leaders, educators, nonprofit directors, and business partners. Tonight, we honor that legacy by recommitting the Morgan Foundation to addressing our community's most pressing needs. From my vantage point, I could see the various members of my family seated at tables near the front. Melissa was nodding along with my words, clearly pleased with how the evening was unfolding. Blake sat with his new fiancée, Jenny, a community organizer he'd met through one of our neighborhood development projects, a relationship that had surprised everyone, perhaps Blake most of all. Uncle Robert and Aunt Victoria were positioned at separate tables, Robert with business associates and Victoria with her charity circuit friends, a practical arrangement that reflected their still distinct spheres of influence. Both, however, appeared genuinely engaged in the proceedings, a marked difference from the perfunctory attendance they might have given such an event in the past. The initiatives we're launching tonight, expanded educational scholarships, neighborhood revitalization grants, and small business incubator support, represent our belief that a community thrives when opportunity is accessible to all its members, I continued. These programs have been developed with input from the very communities they aim to serve, ensuring they address real needs rather than presumed ones. As I outlined the specific commitments the foundation was making, I noticed Walter Blackstone seated near the back of the room, watching the proceedings with evident satisfaction. Though semi-retired now, He remained a trusted advisor and linked to my grandfather's original vision. After concluding my remarks, I introduced Melissa, who would present the details of the education initiative that had become her personal mission over the past year. As she took the podium with confident poise, I moved to the side of the stage, feeling a mixture of pride and appreciation for how far we'd come. "You delivered that perfectly," Victoria commented, as I took my seat at her table during Melissa's presentation. "Harold would have been impressed with your public speaking skills." "Thanks," I replied, accepting the compliment at face value, rather than searching for the hidden critique that might once have accompanied it. "Melissa's the real star tonight, though. This education initiative is transformative." Victoria nodded, watching her daughter with evident pride. "She's found her calling. I never would have predicted it, but it suits her far better than the society path I envisioned." "Sometimes the unexpected path is the right one," I observed. "Indeed," Victoria agreed, her gaze turning thoughtful. "Harold certainly proved that with his final decisions." As Melissa concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause, the event transitioned to its next phase, recognition of community partners who would help implement the new initiatives. I watched as Blake joined her on stage to introduce the neighborhood development components, the two cousins presenting a united front that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. "Quite a transformation," Robert commented, appearing beside me as the formal program concluded and guests began to mingle. "In all of us, I mean. It's been a journey," I acknowledged. "Not always a smooth one." Robert nodded, his expression uncharacteristically reflective. "I've been thinking a lot about what Harold was trying to accomplish with his unconventional approach to succession." "What conclusions have you reached?" I asked, genuinely curious about my uncle's perspective. "That he understood something about family dynamics and wealth that I missed entirely," Robert admitted. "That concentrated power tends to corrupt relationships, while shared purpose can heal them." He gave a self-deprecating smile. "It only took me 40 years in business and my father's death to figure that out." The honest self-assessment represented significant growth for a man who had spent most of his life believing his perspective was invariably correct. "Better late than never," I offered. "Indeed." Robert glanced around the ballroom, taking in the various community leaders engaged in animated conversations with Foundation staff about the newly announced initiatives. "This is different from how we operated in the past. More collaborative, less directive. We're trying to be partners rather than just patrons," I explained. "It's actually more effective in creating sustainable change." Robert considered this. "Your approach has merit, different from Harold's methods, but perhaps an evolution rather than a rejection of them." Coming from Uncle Robert, this was high praise indeed. "We're building on his foundation," I agreed, "just adapting the structure to suit current conditions." As the evening progressed, I circulated among the guests, answering questions about the Foundation's new direction and connecting community leaders with appropriate Morgan staff. Throughout it all, I carried a quiet awareness of how dramatically circumstances had changed since that tense gathering in Harold's living room after the funeral. The letter I had presented to Walter Blackstone that day had set in motion not just a transfer of assets, but a fundamental recalibration of family relationships and purpose. Harold Morgan's final lesson to his family had perhaps been his most valuable. That true legacy transcends wealth and control to encompass values, relationships, and positive impact. 2 years after Harold Morgan's passing, I sat in what had once been his study, now comfortably transformed into a space that reflected both his legacy and my own sensibilities. The imposing mahogany desk remained, but the formal arrangements of business awards and corporate photographs had been supplemented with community impact reports, historical texts, and personal mementos that told a more complete story of the Morgan family's evolution. A knock at the door interrupted my review of the quarterly Foundation metrics. "Come in," I called, expecting Patricia Chen with the latest portfolio updates. Instead, Walter Blackstone entered, moving more slowly than he once had, but still carrying himself with the dignity that had characterized his decades of service to my grandfather. "Walter," I greeted him warmly, rising to help him to a chair. "This is an unexpected pleasure. I thought you were enjoying semi-retirement. Some matters warrant personal attention," he replied, settling into the leather armchair across from the desk. "I've been organizing my files in preparation for fully transferring responsibilities to my successor, and I came across something I believe you should have." He placed a sealed envelope on the desk between us, unlike the formal legal documents we typically exchanged. This was a personal stationery envelope with my name written on it in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "Another letter from Harold?" I asked, surprised. Walter nodded. He left several with me over the years, each with specific instructions about when they should be delivered. This one was to be given to you 2 years after his passing, assuming certain conditions were met. What conditions? I asked, picking up the envelope with curiosity. That the Morgan Enterprises remained intact and that the family was working together in some capacity, however that might look in practice. Walter's eyes crinkled with satisfaction. Conditions that have been fulfilled rather admirably, I might add. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of my grandfather's final communication. Did he leave letters for others as well? He did, Walter confirmed. They'll be delivered according to his instructions, but this one is for you alone. After Walter departed, I sat for several minutes with the unopened letter, reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 2 years. From the shocked silence following the will reading to the carefully reconstructed family relationships of the present, we had traversed terrain none of us could have anticipated. Finally, I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of cream stationery. Dear Alex, the letter began in Harold's precise script. If Walter has delivered this letter, then 2 years have passed since my departure, and you have successfully navigated the initial challenges of leading the Morgan Enterprises. No small accomplishment, particularly given the family dynamics I knowingly complicated with my succession decisions. I smiled at his characteristically direct acknowledgement of the situation he had created. By now you will have discovered what took me far too long to learn, that wealth and power are merely tools, not ends in themselves, and that their true value lies in how they are applied to create meaning and opportunity. You will also have experienced firsthand the complex responsibilities of stewardship, not just of assets, but of relationships and legacy. The insight was so precisely aligned with my experiences of the past 2 years that it was almost unsettling, as if Harold had been observing from beyond. I chose you as my successor, not despite your different path from mine, but because of it. Your historical perspective, ethical grounding, and genuine concern for human impact were qualities the Morgan Enterprises needed, qualities I only fully developed late in life, if at all. I paused in my reading, struck by this explicit confirmation of what I had only inferred from his actions. You may wonder why I orchestrated such a dramatic transition, rather than preparing the family gradually for my decisions. The truth is that I recognized certain patterns that could only be broken through significant disruption. Robert's dominance, Victoria's superficiality, Blake and Melissa's entitlement, these were deeply entrenched characteristics that would have resisted incremental change. His assessment was characteristically blunt, but undeniably accurate. But I also recognized potential in each of them that had been overshadowed by these traits, potential that might emerge under different leadership and incentives. My hope was that by placing you at the center, someone they had overlooked and underestimated, I might create the conditions for genuine transformation. I thought of Melissa's remarkable growth through her work with the foundation, Blake's evolving approach to development projects, and even the gradual shifts in Robert and Victoria's engagement with the family enterprises. Imperfect but real changes that aligned with exactly what Harold had hoped to catalyze. My final piece of advice is simple. Continue to lead with both wisdom and compassion. The former without the latter becomes cold calculation. The latter without the former devolves into ineffective sentimentality. The balance between them is where true impact resides. The letter concluded with a personal note that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I regret the years I spent maintaining unnecessary distance from you, misinterpreting your different choices as rejection of my values rather than thoughtful adaptation of them. Our Tuesday lunches were among the most meaningful hours of my later life. I am proud of you, Alex, and grateful that you will carry forward not just the Morgan name, but its best possibilities. With deep affection, Harold Morgan. I carefully refolded the letter and returned it to its envelope, Harold's final insights providing both confirmation and continued guidance for the path ahead. 5 years after Harold Morgan's death, the expanded Morgan Building lobby hosted a unique gathering, the unveiling of a commissioned art installation commemorating the centennial of Morgan Enterprises' founding. The piece, created by a renowned local artist, incorporated elements of the city's history, the company's evolution, and the community partnerships that had become central to the Morgan identity. As founder and CEO of the original company, Harold featured prominently in the installation, his likeness captured in a way that conveyed both strength and thoughtfulness. Surrounding him were representations of the city landmarks he had helped develop, the industries he had influenced, and, most significantly, the people whose lives had been shaped by his business decisions, both directly and indirectly. I stood slightly apart from the crowd, observing the various family members as they examined the artwork. Melissa, now the full-time executive director of the Morgan Foundation, pointed out details to her husband Ryan, a professor she had met through one of the foundation's education initiatives. Their 2-year-old daughter, named Harriet after her great-grandfather, toddled between them, occasionally steadied by her mother's gentle hand. Blake and his wife Jenny had recently announced they were expecting their first child. The former corporate climber had found unexpected fulfillment in community-oriented development, his natural business acumen now directed toward projects that balanced profit with genuine neighborhood improvement. He stood deep in conversation with several community leaders who had become regular collaborators. Uncle Robert had semi-retired, but remained involved as a strategic advisor, his decades of experience valuable when filtered through the more balanced perspective he had gradually developed. He had even begun mentoring young entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds, a role that seemed to energize him more than his previous corporate dominance ever had. Aunt Victoria had surprised everyone by returning to school for a master's degree in nonprofit management, channeling her social skills and organizational talents into more substantive leadership. She now headed a regional arts council, her genuine passion for cultural development finding appropriate expression. "Quite a family evolution," Walter Blackstone commented, joining me in my observation. Though fully retired now, he remained a welcome presence at significant Morgan events. "Indeed," I agreed. "Not exactly what any of us envisioned 5 years ago, but perhaps what Harold hoped might be possible," Walter suggested, nodding toward the installation where my grandfather's thoughtful expression seemed to watch over the gathering with quiet satisfaction. "I think you're right," I said, though even he might be surprised by some of the specific developments. Walter smiled. "The best legacy plans create conditions for growth rather than attempting to control outcomes." Harold understood that, eventually. As the formal program began, I moved to the small podium that had been arranged near the installation. Looking out at the assembled group, family, employees, community partners, and friends, I felt a moment of profound appreciation for the journey we had all undertaken. 5 years ago, I began, when I unexpectedly became the steward of the Morgan legacy, I understood very little about what that responsibility truly entailed. I knew the history, of course, how my grandfather built this company from a single real estate investment into a diverse enterprise that helped shape our city's development. What I didn't fully grasp was the living nature of legacy, how it continues to evolve through the actions and choices of each person connected to it. I gestured toward the art installation. This commemorative piece doesn't just honor our past. It acknowledges that the true impact of any enterprise ripples outward in ways both intentional and unexpected. My grandfather's decisions affected not just his immediate family and employees, but neighborhoods, institutions, and generations of residents in this city. Looking directly at my assembled family members, I continued, "The most meaningful aspect of the Morgan legacy isn't the buildings we've developed, the investments we've managed, or even the philanthropic initiatives we've launched. It's how we've learned to work together, contributing our diverse talents toward shared purpose rather than competing for control." Blake nodded in acknowledgement, while Melissa smiled warmly, bouncing little Harriet on her hip. Even Robert and Victoria exchanged glances that suggested agreement with this assessment. As we move forward into the next chapter of the Morgan story, we do so with gratitude for the foundation Harold established, respect for the traditions that serve us well, and courage to adapt those that don't. We recognize that wealth and influence are tools for creating value beyond ourselves, not measures of personal worth or achievement. I raised my glass in the direction of Harold's image in the installation. To my grandfather, whose final decision set in motion changes none of us could have anticipated, but all of us have benefited from. And to the ongoing evolution of the Morgan legacy, may it continue to grow in meaning and impact for generations to come. As glasses were raised around the lobby, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished marble wall, a person who had found unexpected purpose not in rejecting or merely preserving a legacy, but in helping it evolve to meet new challenges and opportunities. The letter I had handed to Walter Blackstone that day at the funeral had been just the beginning of a story still being written, by all of us, together. The evening of the centennial celebration continued with a dinner in the Morgan Building's rooftop garden, a space that had been transformed from a rarely used corporate amenity into a vibrant community gathering place that hosted everything from educational workshops to cultural events. Tonight, it was set for an intimate family dinner, a stark contrast to the tense gathering in Harold's living room 5 years earlier. As the meal concluded and servers cleared the dessert plates, I noticed Blake signaling discreetly from across the table. With a slight nod of understanding, I tapped my glass gently, drawing everyone's attention. Before we dispersed for the evening, Blake has something he'd like to share with the family, I announced, yielding the floor to my cousin. Blake stood, looking momentarily nervous despite his usual confidence. Jenny and I wanted to share some news with all of you together. He reached for his wife's hand as she smiled encouragingly. As you know, we're expecting our first child in about 4 months. Nods and smiles around the table acknowledged this already announced news. What we haven't shared yet is that we've learned we're having a boy, Blake continued. And after much discussion, we've decided to name him Harold James Morgan. A ripple of emotion passed through the gathering. The name would honor both my grandfather and my father, a connection to the family's past that felt particularly meaningful given Blake's personal journey over the past 5 years. That's wonderful news, Melissa said warmly, while her daughter Harriet clapped her hands in toddler excitement, not understanding the significance but responding to the positive energy. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, clearly moved by the gesture. Dad would have been honored, he said simply. There's more, Blake added, glancing at Jenny, who nodded encouragingly. We've been talking about our values as parents and the kind of legacy we want to create for our son, and we've made a decision that we wanted to share with all of you first. He took a deep breath. I've accepted a position as Director of Ethical Development at Urban Revival, starting next month. This announcement was met with surprised silence. Urban Revival was a well-respected nonprofit focused on equitable neighborhood development, and notably, not a Morgan enterprise. I'll be stepping away from my role in the Morgan Development Division, Blake clarified, though I hope to continue collaborating on joint projects where our missions align. I studied my cousin's face, seeing both certainty and vulnerability in his expression. This was a significant departure from the path everyone had expected of him, perhaps the most dramatic example yet of how much had changed since Harold's passing. That's a big move, Uncle Robert said carefully. Are you sure it's the right decision? Blake nodded. I found my greatest satisfaction in the community-focused aspects of our development work. This position lets me dedicate myself to that purpose fully. He looked around the table. I know it's not the traditional Morgan path, but I believe it honors the values that have emerged in our family over these past 5 years. I felt a surge of pride in my cousin's courage. I think it's an excellent decision, I said firmly, and a perfect example of how legacy evolves through individual choices aligned with core values. Melissa raised her glass. To Blake and Jenny, and to little Harold James, who will grow up with parents who follow their convictions. As glasses were raised in toast, I caught Uncle Robert watching his son with an expression of complex emotion, pride mingled with the last vestiges of old expectations, giving way to new understanding. After dinner, as family members began to depart, Blake approached me on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city lights. I wanted to thank you, he said without preamble, for creating space for all of us to find our own paths, even when they lead away from what might have been expected. That's what Grandfather ultimately wanted, I replied. Not for us to simply preserve what he built, but to use it as a foundation for something meaningful to each of us. Blake nodded, gazing out at the cityscape where several Morgan-developed buildings were visible in the skyline. It's strange, he reflected. 5 years ago, I was furious about the will, convinced Harold had made a terrible mistake. Now I understand it was the wisest decision he could have made for all of us. For the family as a whole, yes, I agreed, though it created some difficult moments along the way. Life-changing moments, Blake corrected. I was on a path that looked successful but felt increasingly empty. Harold's decision, and your leadership afterward, created the disruption I needed to find a different way forward. As we stood in companionable silence, I thought about the letter from my grandfather that Walter had delivered 3 years earlier, with its assessment that certain patterns could only be broken through significant disruption. Harold had been right, though perhaps even he couldn't have predicted the specific ways each family member would evolve once freed from established roles and expectations. Do you think he knew? Blake asked, as if following my thoughts. How it would all unfold? Not specifically, I replied, echoing what I'd told Melissa years earlier at the cemetery. But I think he hoped, and I think he would be pleased. Not because we've all followed some predetermined path, but because we've each found authentic purpose. Blake nodded, a smile forming. Harold James Morgan will grow up in a very different family than the one we knew as children. A better one, I think, I said, as we turned to rejoin the others. Built on the best parts of Grandfather's legacy, but not limited by its constraints. The letter I had handed Walter Blackstone that day at the funeral had initiated more than a transfer of assets. It had begun a transformation of an entire family system, creating space for each member to discover their own meaningful contribution, rather than competing for control of a narrowly defined legacy. In that sense, it had been my grandfather's greatest gift to all of us. 10 years after Harold Morgan's passing, I stood at the podium in the community center that bore his name, addressing the gathered crowd at the dedication of the completed Harold Morgan Memorial Library and Education Complex. The project, a collaboration between the Morgan Foundation and the city, represented the culmination of a decade of evolving partnership between the Morgan family enterprises and the community they had helped shape for over a century. My grandfather often said that buildings were merely structures until filled with purpose, I began, looking out at the diverse audience of community members, civic leaders, and family. Today, we dedicate not just a building, but a living resource that will serve generations of citizens seeking knowledge, opportunity, and connection. From my vantage point, I could see the various members of the extended Morgan family scattered throughout the audience. Melissa sat with her husband and their 3 children, including 12-year-old Harriet, who had developed her mother's organizational talents and her great-grandfather's sharp business instincts. Blake and Jenny were there with 9-year-old Harold James, a thoughtful boy with his father's analytical mind and his mother's social conscience. Even Uncle Robert, now fully retired but still mentally sharp at 82, attended with his current companion, a retired judge with whom he'd found unexpected happiness in his later years. Aunt Victoria had passed away 2 years earlier, but her influence lived on through the arts education wing that bore her name. 10 years ago, I continued, when my grandfather made his final decisions about the future of the Morgan legacy, none of us could have anticipated exactly where that path would lead. We knew only that he had entrusted us with something precious, not just assets to be preserved, but values to be lived and a purpose to be fulfilled. I gestured toward the building behind me, its modern design incorporating elements of the historic Morgan building downtown, while adding sustainable features and accessible spaces that reflected contemporary needs. This complex represents not just my grandfather's name, but the evolution of his vision, a vision that expanded over his lifetime from purely business success to encompass community impact and lasting contribution. It also represents the collective efforts of the Morgan family, each member contributing their unique talents and perspectives to create something none of us could have accomplished alone. I saw Blake nod in acknowledgement from his seat beside Jenny. His work with urban revival had eventually led to an innovative partnership with the Morgan Development Division, creating a model for equitable community development that had gained national recognition. As we open these doors today, we invite everyone to share in this resource, to learn, to connect, to grow, and to contribute their own chapters to our community's ongoing story. After the formal ribbon cutting and as guests explored the new facility, I found myself standing in the building's central atrium beside a bronze plaque that bore not just Harold's name and likeness, but an inscription taken from the letter he had left with Walter Blackstone. The true test of wealth isn't how much you accumulate or control, but how effectively you deploy it to create value beyond yourself. He would be proud, you know. I turned to find Melissa beside me, her expression reflective as she studied the plaque. Of the building? I asked. Of all of it, she clarified. The foundation, the businesses, the partnerships, but mostly of us, how we've grown into something better than what we were before. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It's strange to think how differently things might have turned out if he hadn't made such a dramatic choice in his will. If he'd followed the expected path of dividing things fairly, or simply left it all to Uncle Robert as the eldest son, we wouldn't be here, Melissa said simply. Not just at this dedication, but here as people. The people we've become. Her assessment was accurate. Harold's unconventional decisions, and the letter I had presented to Walter Blackstone that day at the funeral, had set in motion a cascade of changes that had transformed not just the Morgan enterprises, but each member of the family in profound and unexpected ways. The funny thing is, I mused, I think his greatest legacy isn't this building or even the Morgan businesses. It's that he created the conditions for all of us to discover our own authentic contributions. Melissa smiled, her gaze drifting to where her daughter was earnestly explaining something to Blake's son, the next generation of Morgans already forming their own connections and perspectives. That's what makes it a living legacy, she agreed. Not preserved in amber, but constantly evolving. As we moved to join the others for the community reception, I reflected on the long, sometimes challenging journey from that tense gathering after the funeral to this moment of genuine celebration. Harold Morgan's final lessons, delivered through his will, his letters, and the deliberate disruption he had engineered, had ultimately been about the true nature of legacy, not wealth hoarded or controlled, but purpose discovered and shared. The letter I had handed to Walter Blackstone that day had been just the beginning of a story that continued to unfold, generation by generation, each adding their own chapters to a narrative far richer and more meaningful than any of us could have written alone. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own relationship with legacy, whether family, professional, or personal. Like Harold Morgan, we all leave imprints that extend beyond our immediate circumstances, affecting others in ways we might not fully anticipate. Consider whether there are letters you should be writing, not necessarily literal documents, but clear expressions of your values and hopes for those who will carry your influence forward. The most meaningful legacies aren't built on control, but on creating conditions that allow others to find their authentic contributions. Think about the Tuesday lunches in your own life, those quiet, consistent connections that might be more significant than more visible achievements or possessions. Often, it's these regular interactions that build the deepest understanding and create the most lasting impact. If you're navigating complicated family dynamics, particularly around inheritance or succession issues, remember that wealth and influence are tools, not measures of personal worth. True value comes from how these resources are deployed to create meaning and opportunity, not from their mere possession or control. Subscribe to our channel for more stories exploring family dynamics, inheritance challenges, and the courage to forge authentic paths even amid expectations. Next week, we'll share another powerful narrative about finding unexpected purpose through difficult transitions. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, may you create a legacy defined not by what you accumulate, but by how your presence enhances the lives of others.